South Africans to live in a home under the sea was started by Brent Addison and John Gibbs in 1969 in Durban. A project team led by Brent and including well-known marine scientist Dr. Alan Haydorn was formed in early 1970. 2 molasses tanks were donated to the project by HUNUC and converted into the outer shell of the underwater habitat by Delville Engineering, a subsidiary of HUNUC. The original 16mm film, made by Burt Martins, had no soundtrack. It was converted to video and the voice and music added by Brent Addison. In addition, various still photos and newspaper clippings were added to try and complete the HUNUC story. The completed habitat shell was delivered to the University of Natal sports grounds in early 1971, and the complex task of fitting it out for its journey under the sea began. It was immediately dubbed the Yellow Submarine by the media, and from then on received press coverage throughout South Africa and worldwide. The tank was divided in 2 halves, the upper level being the living and working area, and the lower the space for 12 by 50 litre air and oxygen cylinders and 20 tons of ballast. In the upper level there were 3 rooms, the entrance and toilet shower, the sleeping, eating and living area, and the laboratory or working area. Various companies donated fittings including stove, seen being loaded by Vaughn Stone and helpers through the window to the upper level, geyser, gas panel, electrical fittings, electronics, etc. Painting the name on the outside was a tricky task, balanced on a makeshift scaffolding. The names of all the sponsors were also painted on one side, ensuring that they got good publicity in the press wherever HUNUC went. Fitting anything in the cramped space was a difficult task, none more so than getting the geyser fitted under the workbench in the laboratory, which required the manoeuvrings of a contortionist. HUNUC, when completed, was 6.7 meters long, 4.2 meters wide, and 4.5 meters high. It weighed around 20 tons when empty, and with ballast, which would be loaded when it arrived at the quay in Durban Harbour, would be nearly 45 tons. John Gibbs, co-founder of the HUNUC Project, is seen here climbing into the upper level by way of the entrance tunnel. During the submergence process, heavy steel plates were bolted on both the upper and lower sides of the entrance tunnel. The lower one was the cause of much drama in the first submergence trial, as we will see later. After the fitting out was complete, HUNUC set off on its next journey, here seen being loaded onto the Delville Engineering flatbed transporter. With a police escort, it left its home at the university for a journey through town, followed by a convoy of excited spectators. Due to its height, it needed all the overhead telephone and electrical wires to be raised, which were done with the help of the Durban Corporation, arranged by our electrical engineer, Ernest Clayton. Although the idea of HUNUC was now well on its way to being a reality, following it on its land-based travels still seemed somewhat unreal. Now, with less than a month to launch date, activity was at a fever pitch. We did our normal jobs during the day and worked on HUNUC at night and weekends. The journey down West Street past the famous old Greenacres and then onto its resting place at the Bayside Garage on the Esplanade. Here it was open to the public and stood on show for several weeks. During this time, many thousands of visitors clambered up inside and were fascinated by the cramped living quarters and the array of gas, electrical and electronic equipment. Tony Day, our hard-working publicity officer, is seen here directing the habitat to its position at the Bayside. Then, towards the end of March 1972, HUNUC set off on its last land-based journey to the quayside at Salisbury Island. Even this was fraught with difficulty, as we discovered that it wouldn't fit under the overhanging roof of the customs gate. By letting down the ties on one side, and by tilting everything alarmingly on that side, we just managed to squeeze through and breathed another sigh of relief. Once at Salisbury Island, HUNUC was lifted back onto its bed of railway sleepers, and the final preparation for its first journey to the seabed began. By now, the press were publishing stories and photos about HUNUC almost every day. A popular picture was Jackie, the HUNUC mascot, seen here with Brent admiring the electronics panel. Later, a picture of the gas panel without Jackie appeared in colour in the Sunday Tribune. At the quayside, the next major job was to load the ballast into the lower chamber. Several tons of manganese were loaded into trucks and then by hand through small ports at each end. This was followed by tons of scrap steel to try and keep the manganese in position. Later, this loose manganese and scrap steel would contribute to the downfall of HUNUC. Loading continued for several days, as over 15 tons of manganese were needed. Brent is seen here, supervising the next load to the quayside. After the ballast came the extra buoyancy. By now we had calculated that we needed 5 or 6 tons of positive buoyancy to get HUNUC back to the surface after it was submerged. Again Delville Engineering came to our rescue. They welded a steel framework to the outside of HUNUC, and South African Diving Services lent us 4 by 1.5 ton steel buoyancy tanks. Derek Erie and Malcolm Smale lend a hand to load the steel. Raising the 1.5-ton steel tanks into position proved to be a major obstacle, as it seemed impossible to lift them into place by manpower alone. As the despondent team sat wondering what to do next, Graham MacDonald disappeared and returned shortly, driving a large mobile Navy crane. The tanks were whipped quickly into place, and the crane returned just as quickly to its resting place. Next day, the day before the launch, Vice Admiral Johnson and his aide arrived for an inspection and were welcomed by Brent. They climbed through the entrance tunnel and were served tea made on HUNUC's own stove. They were shown the gas panel and given a detailed explanation of what it would be like to live under the sea. The Admiral was immensely impressed that a bunch of amateurs with no money could have constructed what had cost others, Cousteau in France and Commander Bond in the USA, millions of dollars. The Admiral and his aide left shaking their heads at the thought that anyone would contemplate living under the sea in a contraption such as HUNUC. Launch day finally arrived. A harbour tug nudged the 60-ton floating crane into place, and Brent and Alan welcomed guests including the Mayor and Mayoress of Durban and Vice Admiral Johnson. Dr. Alan Haydorn addressed the assembled crowd and paid tribute to the energy and tenacity of the HUNUC team and looked forward to the contribution that HUNUC might make to science and technology. He was followed by Brent, who thanked all the participants in HUNUC, particularly the sponsors and the press. He related the tale of HUNUC so far and expressed the hope that the next few months would see South Africa take a major step forward in undersea research. He too paid tribute to the team, saying that despite the hundreds of voluntary hours spent by all, HUNUC, as it stood before us, ready to be launched, was a minor miracle. Finally, it was Admiral Johnson's turn. He told us that in all his years in the Navy, he had never been called upon to launch a ship. Now his first chance had arrived, and he didn't know if he was launching a ship, a house, or a submarine. He blessed the yellow submarine and all who might sail, live in her. With a mighty heave, the bottle of champagne broke cleanly on the bow side. crane then carefully lifted HUNUC off its blocks and swung it out over the water. The audience held its breath as the huge crane lowered it carefully into the water. This was by far the riskiest part of the HUNUC story to date, as we had no way of testing HUNUC for leaks before it was lowered into the water. Securely bolted inside was John Gibbs, whose job was to check for leaks, and if there were none, to signal the release of the crane. He also released air into HUNUC from the air banks in the hull to balance the internal and external pressure before the divers could remove the bottom entrance plate. It was John's job to remove the top entrance plate. Some of the bolts on the bottom plate proved very difficult to release and resulted in Malcolm Smell getting his ankle cracked when the final ones came free and the plate fell on him. Finally, HUNUC was moored along the quayside, floating serenely at the window level. This was in fact too high up, and indicated that our calculation of the weight of the manganese and steel was too low. A tired but happy crew, Ernest Clayton, Vaughn Stone, Brent and Jan Wallach reviewed the day's events as the sun settled on an epic day. Part of the sponsorship program was to get more press coverage. Here, Brent and John demonstrated Draeger diving equipment, donated by Premier Medical Equipment. The new day dawned with much to be done. Malcolm Smell jumping in and Jan Wallach on top began the final preparation for submergence. Later, Jan inside is seen fixing minor leaks at the window. John Gibbs, Roland Troutman, and Graham MacDonald are busy filling the 50-litre air banks and diving cylinders. In order to boost the ballast, Ernest Clayton obtained 4 tons of lead from the Durban Corporation, and using an ingenious pulley contraption and a floating bucket, the team began the very difficult task of loading these into the hull. It was all hands on deck and took 18 hours working in continuous shifts to complete the task. When Alan Haydorn came for a visit, the place was a hive of activity, getting everything ready for the first submergence trials. Finally, Graham welded frames for some of the blocks so that they could be suspended by a chain from both ends. As HUNUC sank, the theory was that these blocks would hit the bottom and therefore reduce the rate of descent. Since by now divers were spending many hours in HUNUC, we needed to keep up a fresh supply of air. The 50-litre tanks of air, orange, and oxygen, black, were thrown into the water and manoeuvred into place by the divers. Dr. Tim McClurg, coming out for a warm cup of coffee, and Graham MacDonald doing his flipper first servicing act, were some of the antics recorded by Butch Martins behind the camera. In order to keep the air in HUNUC clean, a chemical called berylime was used to scrub out the CO2. Here, new canisters were ready to be taken below. We obtained 2 huge blocks of lead, which were laid at the submergence site of HUNUC, which we had chosen at Vetch's Pier. These would be used to anchor HUNUC at its resting place on the seabed. This was another issue where our calculations were going to prove less than what was needed. We were now ready for the first submergence trials in Durban Bay. This time John Gibbs and Jan Wallach were bolted inside, and the ballast tanks were slowly filled. All went according to plan, and in the late evening HUNUC descended to the bottom of the bay. Air pressure was equalized and the hatches removed, and Tim McClurg entered from the outside and is seen on closed-circuit TV, signalling that all is well. The only other shots taken while submerged were these 35mm slides. They show Malcolm Smale at the window looking in, Brent and Malcolm talking on the telephone, and Graham, Malcolm and Jan relaxing around the dinner table. Jan Wallach and Malcolm Smale spent over a week submerged in HUNUC in Durban Bay, proving conclusively that we could live under the sea in HUNUC for extended periods. The Navy diving ship SAS Fleur arrived a week before the launch. It would provide logistical support, including a decompression chamber and compressed air from its large onboard compressors and air banks. It would also be used to tow HUNUC out to sea. While the aquanauts lived peacefully below, preparations on the Fleur were a hive of activity, loading the lead blocks and getting ready to raise HUNUC back to the surface. After living in HUNUC for 2 weeks, it was brought back to the surface in a gush of bubbles. After a few nervous moments bobbing up and down, it settled down, floating serenely, if a little deeper than before. Tim gives the okay. At low tide, the gangplank gave new meaning to walking the plank. With HUNUC ready, it was time to turn our attention to Vetch's Pier. It was here that the power, water and telephone cables, over 600 metres of them, were being readied to be towed out to sea. Malcolm and Tim are the cable winders, while helpers attach buoys and manoeuvre the cables into the sea. On the seaward end, 2 ski boats from the Natal Anti-Shark Measures Board did the pulling. A human chain was needed to get the cables through the shallow water. The map of limestone reef off Durban's Addington beach shows the position where HUNUC would be fixed to the seabed and connected to its umbilical cord. Living under the sea at the depth at which HUNUC was to be placed at limestone reef of nearly 10 metres for more than 24 hours would mean that the aquanauts would become saturated with nitrogen. This meant that they could not return directly to the surface. A wire grid was laid over limestone from the site of HUNUC to ensure that the divers would not get lost, and a breathing station, an inverted fiberglass dome, was placed at the outer edge of the grid in case of emergency. Limestone reef had an abundance of sea life, and the inside, where HUNUC was to be positioned, was a maze of gullies and small caves, and in places was up to 10 metres deep at high tide. Each team of aquanauts planned to undertake a series of scientific experiments, ranging from studying the behavior of specific types of marine life to the effect that living in close confinement would have on members of the team. These experiments would have added a considerable body of knowledge about the little-known underwater world and the creatures that live in it. On the 3rd of May 1972, the SAS Fleur manoeuvred into position and took HUNUC in tow for its last fateful journey. It was here that another event occurred which was to have a marked effect on the fate of HUNUC. Although we'd been cleared to leave the harbour in the early morning, it was after 3 p.m. before the port captain finally gave us the signal to proceed. With the harbour craft making up the rear, and a towing signal at the Fleur's masthead, we set out for the open sea. For an underwater house, HUNUC towed quite well, and with Brent, Alan and John and Lieutenant Commander Jan Joubert, the first team of aquanauts aboard, the harbour mouth was cleared, and we were soon over the submergence spot inside Limestone Reef. The sea was flat calm in the morning before we set out, but by the time HUNUC was attached to its anchor blocks, a large swell was moving in over Limestone. Even with this new handicap, the team had HUNUC on the bottom within an hour. Although we were able to attach HUNUC to its anchor blocks, as soon as we opened the entrance tunnel, the conditions inside quickly became impossible. The swells going overhead were causing large pressure fluctuations, and releasing air via the panel wasn't enough to stop the water flooding into the upper chamber. Darrell Smith, who was inside during the descent, was rescued by the diving team and reported impossible conditions inside. With HUNUC now sideways on to the swell and jumping several feet each time a large wave went overhead, it was becoming extremely dangerous for divers to be anywhere near it. At 9:30 in the evening, Brent called all divers out of the water. By this time the swell was over 2 meters, and big waves were breaking on Limestone Reef. Next morning, our worst fears were confirmed. HUNUC had dragged its anchors during the night and was now hard up against the inside of Limestone Reef, wedged in a gully. The swells were now up to 3 meters, and diving was extremely dangerous. What followed was several frustrating days, trying to refloat our brave little habitat and tow it away from the rocks where it was getting bashed to pieces. For several days, the team stuck at an impossible task in atrocious diving conditions. The outside framework with the buoyancy tanks had broken away from the tank in places and was flapping wildly with each passing wave. In zero visibility, this was a death trap, and we were very fortunate that no one was seriously hurt. Finally, we were able to move the stricken habitat inshore, away from the reef. During this critical period, communications from the shore base were manned by Beulah Davies, head of the Natal Anti-Shark Measures Board, whose ski boats were loaned for the operation. When the sea calmed down and the visibility improved, we were able to go down and assess the damage. HUNUC was lying on its side. A huge hole in the lower tank had allowed much of the manganese ballast to escape. In the upper half, the equipment was wrecked. HUNUC was finished. What was left became a salvage operation, taking out as much of the lead, equipment, buoyancy tanks and cables as we could. During this 4-week period, the sea was flat calm and the water clean, as if to tell us what might have been. On every dive we saw an abundance of sea life and contemplated what might have been. One dive showed 2 baby batfish who had taken up residence outside HUNUC and had greeted us each time we approached. We might have been sitting inside looking at them through the window. With the clean water, we could now really see the extent of the damage and the power of the sea. On every dive, we could only marvel at the abundance of sea life on limestone. Shoals of snappers, scorpionfish, etc., mingled with us on each visit to our stricken home. Towards the end of the salvage operation, we arranged one last team dive. All the key team members participated. We visited HUNUC and swam in the now darkened interior. Since there was still a pocket of air trapped in the upper chamber, we were able to hold a conversation underwater, almost as if it was the real thing. When Derek Airy displayed a huge crayfish from Vetch's Pier, we knew that we'd missed a wonderful chance to advance man's knowledge of living in the world without sun. We used inflatable buoys to lift heavy items from the seabed. These greatly simplified the salvage operation, as it was easy to tow even the largest object to the shore. Finally, the last item, the Oceanographic Research Institute shark cage, was brought to the surface and dragged to the shore. This was the end.